Hey guys, hope you're having a good week so far. This is your last video for the school year, and we are going to kind of wrap up the major discussion on civil rights. There's so much that we could talk about in detail, but this is kind of the most important need to know information about that kind of era of the 1960s civil rights movement. And so last time I talked to you guys about this, we talked about kind of how the movement grew out of World War II and a lot of African American soldiers seeing what could be and really getting in their hearts and saying, this is um, what we want, this is what we're ready to push for. Um, and then leading into, Rosa Parks, leading into the bus boycotts led by Martin Luther King Jr. And so you really see things take off, guys, and a new form of activism come into play, several new forms actually, which are sit-ins and marches. So in 1958, you had two young African Americans. They went to Dockham's drugstore in Wichita, Kansas. So back then, guys, these drugstores, they typically were kind of like a general store plus a diner. So think on Main Street. So Mrs. Floyd's uh, drugstore that she owns. Okay, so you had a counter where you could be served food and usually like milkshakes and things like that. Soda fountain. That's actually kind of the drugstore thing where it came from. Was that they sold soda, which late 1800s, around the turn of the century, uh, was considered to have medicinal um, value. Some of those. And so that's where that all comes from. But anyway, so the point is you could be served food and drinks and things like that at these drugstores. And at this drugstore, like a lot of drugstores and restaurants during that time, if you were an African American, especially in the South, you did not expect to be able to be, seated and served at a restaurant or at one of these drugstore counters. You, if you even got to go in, had to get it to go, or some places they'd make you go around back and they'd have kind of a spot where they would serve you food around back. Um, but that was um, the reality for a lot of African Americans in the United States at that time. So you have these two African Americans, very young individuals. One was 19, one was 20. They're both members of the NAACP Youth Council there in Wichita. And here's another case, guys, where our state was making history here. So we talked about Brown versus the Board of Education, and then here you have these young African Americans in Wichita staging what became known as the first sit-in. So people saying, "Hey, I'm going to sit at this counter, and if you refuse me service, you're losing money because other people. I'm going to stay here until you do serve me because other people are not going to be able to sit at the counter and be served." And so even if you don't fill all the seats up, a lot of times uh, there was white patrons that would come in and say, well, I'm not sitting by this black person and leave. And so they're losing lots and lots of business. This was a successful sit-in. Eventually the owner of Dockham's Drugstore went into the manager and said, hey, serve them. I'm losing way too much money. And so this showed if you hit people in their wallets, you could make a big change. And so this really explodes 2 years later, guys, in 1960 in Greensboro, North Carolina. That's where the media really focused, and that's what gets a lot of the credit for starting these students in Greensboro, for starting these sit-ins. But, we got to get our due here in Kansas, and that's where it really started, was in Wichita in 1958, 2 years, roughly 2 years before. But it really takes off in 1960. And then marches, guys, become a big deal as well. So 1963, you have Martin Luther King Jr. He's trying to put pressure on Congress to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and he puts together this march on Washington, D.C. Huge participation from demonstrators, over 200,000 demonstrators, of all races that took part. So you had plenty of white people joining these demonstrations, this march to Washington, D.C. And then from that you have the "I Have a Dream" speech and all that. And then he organizes another march, much smaller march, around 500 people in Selma, Alabama. And so they were going to march from Selma, Alabama to the capital of Alabama in Montgomery. But this is quite a march, guys. This is roughly 50 miles that they're going to march. But on the way, the sheriff of Selma tried to stop them from marching over this bridge that they had to march over um, to continue on to Montgomery. And video, video cameras, television cameras are covering this march. This is a big deal in 1965, and basically he and his deputies are attacking these peaceful protesters, and it's being all caught on television, and it's shown on the news that night across the United States. And this really outraged a lot of people. It really forced President Kennedy to do something to show that he was in control of the situation, and wasn't letting these kind of things happen. And so this also is going to force another act by Congress. And so that's really the point, guys, is this activism that we see from Martin Luther King Jr., from members of the NAACP. A lot of these people are young individuals, both students in high school and college especially. And, for example, one that I mentioned, the Freedom Riders, you had a bunch of college students who were protesting segregation of buses, even though the United States government had said, hey, you cannot use basically segregation on American highways and interstates. It's not legal. And so they tried to push to show, hey, this is still going on, the segregation. And so you had these college students riding on a bus together, whites and African Americans together. They were in one place brutally beaten, and this was caught on camera as well. But yeah, this activism, a lot of younger individuals, young adults taking part in this and saying, hey, this is not right, what's going on, and I want to be a part of the solution. And this is what led to legal action. This is what led to the government saying, okay, enough of this, we have to do something about this. And so I referenced this earlier. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was a product of all this activism. And this really said, okay, no more segregation in most cases, especially in schools. They desegregated schools. And then also focused on employment opportunities, equal employment opportunities for minorities. And also gave a tremendous amount of power to the federal attorney general to prosecute civil rights crimes. And so this really gave teeth to previous civil rights acts, is what it really did. And then the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So this basically said, okay, we're going to send federal examiners to these people, instead of local examiners to register people to vote. We're going to send federal examiners because the local ones in the South were not registering people. People would show up to register and they'd get beaten up and things like that to try and keep African Americans from voting. And also banned literacy tests. We talked about literacy tests. That was an old, I guess, old tool used by the South, even going back to right after Reconstruction ended. and so this was still being used to keep African Americans from voting, so they banned that as well. Said, nope, you can't do that anymore, to really make sure that African Americans are being fairly represented in government, and that's through voting. Okay, to make sure that they're actually being allowed to vote if they're supposed to be able to. And then finally, guys, I want to talk to you about really kind of, this is more of a Latin American issue, but they're a part of this civil rights movement as well. We focus on, usually the African American side of the civil rights movement, but there's this whole civil rights movement going on, Native American movement. We talked about AIM last semester. These people that were the American Indian movement fighting for Native American rights. You have people fighting for rights for disabilities. People fighting for rights as far as their, women. There's going to be a fight for that. There's going to be people fighting for their rights as far as their sexuality and things like that. So really, this whole movement that really goes on from the 1960s into the 1980s is when we start to see that kind of lessen to a certain degree. Certainly still out there in certain forms, but definitely lessened by the 1980s. But you have the United Farm Workers. So late 1960s, Cesar Chavez, he is going to organize migrant workers in California. They're underpaid. They don't have any job security. They don't have any benefits. Pretty poor working conditions, living conditions. And so he helps create a union called the United Farm Workers. And this union basically set up a boycott of California grapes, which was the biggest, grossing, basically the biggest selling agricultural product in California, that was being harvested by these migrant farmers. Guys, so they set up a boycott starting in 1966, and they boycotted for roughly 4 years until 1970. And this really hurt the California grape industry. It hurt California farmers. And so they, once again, guys, it's the power of the wallet, hitting people where it hurts in their wallet, that they finally gave in to the demands for higher pay and better working conditions. And it was a successful boycott. And he really helped a lot of these migrant farm workers. Okay, so that's kind of the high points, the big pieces to this continued civil rights movement that we've been talking about. I know that this year hasn't gone as expected for you guys, but keep plugging away, and hopefully we'll get to a place where we can be face to face again, and we can resume things as normal. So thanks, guys, and have a great summer.